Thank you, everyone. Super great to be back in Poland. I've missed all of you so much. It's also nice to see a lot of new faces. Hello to everyone joining online. Thank you for joining online. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is the art of negotiation. So most people, when they think of negotiation, they think of big business deals or maybe hostage situations. But as activists, we all negotiate all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. Over the last 21 years, I've been doing kind of a specialized form of negotiation, and that is for corporate animal welfare policies. And the content and the principles in this presentation are directly from that experience. They are not regurgitated from some pop science book. However, with that being said, I have borrowed some terminology from some popular and leading negotiators, which I also found to be true independently. I understand not everyone in here does corporate negotiation, so I did my best to select principles that apply generally to negotiation, and I hope that you find them very helpful in your advocacy for animals. So I got most of my experience in negotiation working for the Humane League, an organization I helped found in 2005. And we exist to end the abuse of animals raised for food. And we have offices in the US, the UK, Mexico, and Japan. We also founded the Open Wing Alliance in 2016. It's a coalition of 90 organizations from around the world, many of whom are here today, who all work together under the shared mission of ending the abuse of chickens worldwide. And we contribute to this cause by getting the largest food companies on earth to abolish the worst practices in factory farming in their supply chains. And this includes things like cages for egg-laying hens. And we accomplish this by unapologetically and very aggressively attacking huge food-buying corporations. We've had a lot of success in this area. We have secured more than 2,900 policies from food corporations around the world. And while all of these policies were won through various means, they do all have one thing in common, and that is that negotiation was absolutely instrumental in winning them. And I know this because I've led personally hundreds of these negotiations myself. And this is where the vast majority of my experience in negotiation comes from, and is also what is based off of for the principles that I will be sharing with you today. And while I have also led negotiations for many other types of animal rights issues, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be using the cage-free corporate negotiation throughout the presentation, and I'm going to stick with that for my examples. But before we dive into the principles, what is negotiation? Let me start out with what negotiation is not. Negotiation is not compromise. Most people, when they hear negotiation, they think about finding some middle ground where both parties are equally dissatisfied, as Henry Clay once said. But this is not negotiation. Are there times where we have to compromise within a negotiation? Yes, but negotiation should not be thought of as being defined by these terms. The way I like to think about negotiation is more like manipulation. Anytime you enter a transaction with another person, you are negotiating. And this could be anything from deciding where you want to go to eat, to doing vegan outreach, even trying to get your dog to stop barking. That's a negotiation. It's one that I tend to lose pretty often. But what you're really doing in each of these situations is you are manipulating the situation so that you can get the best possible outcome. Of course, there are always parameters that you are working within, which set the limits to how much you can actually manipulate the situation. And these are defined, of course, by reality. So you can't always get exactly what you want. But you can work within those limitations to optimize the outcome to be in your favor. And that is what negotiation is about. Take example, ordering a cup of coffee. When you order a cup of coffee, there are only so many possible outcomes. You will either get exactly what you wanted, or you will get a messed up order and not the nice soy latte that you wanted to start your day with. Now, there are a lot of factors here that will influence the outcome that are totally out of your control. Maybe the cashier is having just a bad day. Maybe the barista is new, or the staff are just still in training, or they're short-staffed that day. And you definitely cannot control how your barista spells your name on your cup. But think about how many factors are in your control. You have your behavior towards the cashier. You have the option of being polite, making them smile. You can tip them. You also have substitutions from the menu. You can ask them to make your drink with less sugar or with extra soy milk. You also have your rapport with the barista. You can make them laugh, crack a joke, make their day a little more pleasant, interact with them. But you also have the option of just being plain rude to the staff. You could rush them. You could complain if they are taking too long. And if you do this, maybe you'll get your coffee a little faster. But you also may be getting more than just soy milk in your coffee. Plus, you have to think about the next time you come in. The staff will remember how you made them feel. So the next time you come in may not be a very pleasant experience. But the point is, while you can't control everything, there are always factors under your control, and there are always levers that you can pull to optimize the outcome in any situation. And understanding these levers and pulling them in a strategic way, that is the art of negotiation. Now, of course, all the type of negotiation we all do as activists is a little more tricky than just ordering a cup of coffee. It typically involves changing someone's deeply held beliefs, could involve changing societal norms, even personal habits, and changing someone's mind is not an easy thing to do. People have been trying to understand how to do this since the dawn of civilization. Aristotle wrote about this in the 4th century BC, and we still have no idea how to do it in totality. Otherwise, we would all be doing it, and all of our friends and family would be vegan by now. That's why negotiation is more of an art than a science. Plus, some people are like cats, and not everyone is easy to negotiate with. While there's no magic formula, just following some guiding principles can increase your chances of winning. So next, I'm going to go over 7 key principles of negotiation. And within each principle, I'll share tips on how to apply them, along with real-life examples and specific tactics. The first principle is listening. And I put this one first for a reason. Listening, I think, is one of the most undervalued principles in negotiation. Everyone has a profound psychological need to feel like they are being heard and that their message is being received by the other person. And until they feel this, they're not going to be listening to you. They're going to be preoccupied with getting their point across, and vice versa. And you'll simply be just talking past one another. And the conversation will just get absolutely nowhere. So in order to be heard, you first have to listen. But you don't only want to listen to get your point across. Critical listening skills can also help you understand the entire situation better and give you an advantage in the negotiation. Negotiation is a process of discovery, and you should never enter one with strong assumptions about the topic or about the other person that you're negotiating with. Instead, you should first develop a hypothesis and then test that in the conversation. For example, if you're meeting with a company and trying to get them to stop caging animals, and the executive is simply listing a bunch of excuses as to why they can't do it, and they don't make any sense, and they don't have much logic to them, what does that tell you? That tells you there is a hidden reason as to why they're not going cage-free. So you can start driving the conversation to try to get at that real reason, instead of just arguing all the excuses that they just listed. Critical listening also involves not only listening to the actual words the other person is speaking, but it also involves a sincere effort to try to truly understand what they actually mean. And once you grasp this, then you have to accurately repeat it back to the other person. And when you do this, you'll find that the other person will feel like they're being heard. They'll be less focused on what they want to say, and they'll just be more psychologically primed to receive your message. Now, I think we can all relate to this. Like, you can think back to, an experience or a discussion you were having with someone where you thought to yourself, this person is an absolute moron. They are not listening to anything I'm saying. But now, just reimagine a discussion like that, where the person not only clearly was listening to you, but they stated back to you your own argument in a way that you were even impressed with the summary. So how would you feel when that happened? Immediately you would just feel like your message was gotten across, your guard would be immediately lowered, and you would be more open to hearing what the other person has to say. Now, when you mirror back to another person, there's other advantages to this. For instance, it has the ability to help the other person see the flaws in their own logic once they hear it repeated back. Now, many activists are afraid to summarize the other person's point of view. And maybe that's because it's flawed, or their point of view is unethical, or it goes against their own interests somehow. This is a total mistake. Instead, when engaging with someone, you should just mirror what they're saying. And this is where you can really break open negotiations that once seemed closed. Former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss talks about another type of mirroring. But this kind is for the purpose of keeping the other person talking. Because when the other person keeps talking, they start divulging more and more information, way more than they were planning on giving you. And I actually have direct experience from the FBI with this. When I was a teenager, I started a pretty radical animal rights group in my hometown. And the FBI launched a 4-year investigation against the organization. And I was regularly harassed and interrogated by the FBI. I was 17 years old at the time. I was still living with my mom. And I was going downstairs one morning to get a bowl of cereal. And there were 2 federal agents in my living room. And they were like, "Good morning, Mr. Ross." And I was like, "Good morning." And then they sat me down, and they interrogated me, asked me so many questions. I was not planning on giving them any information. I hated the FBI, and I was not going to share any details with them. But during the conversation, they used this mirroring trick, and I found myself sharing all types of details with them, and I didn't understand why. For instance, they would ask, "Where were you this one night?" And I would be like, "Oh, I'm at my friend Paul's house." And they would say, "Paul's house?" And I'd be like, "Oh yeah, he lives on this side of town." So basically, what they're doing is they're repeating back just the last 2 words of my sentence with a curious inflection, and then I just keep talking. It's amazing how well that works. So with this simple trick, now they know who I'm friends with, they know where that person lives, and they know I was there that night. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. It was like a magic trick. It's extremely effective, and as activists, we should be using this too. Finally, listening well is not so easy. We get distracted, we engage in selective listening, our minds act on a cognitive bias for consistency with our own beliefs rather than what's actually true. So most people enter negotiations preoccupied with their own arguments and their own position and their own assumptions. And then because of that, they're actually unable to process information accurately. They may hear things that were not even said. They totally misunderstand and misinterpret the entire situation. So it's critical that you remain very aware of this bias when you practice listening. All right, the second principle is to establish trust with your opponent that you will be negotiating with. In Kurt Vonnegut's book, Breakfast of Champions, one of the main characters has a dog that was in an accident, and the dog had a tail that could no longer wag. So that dog would get in a lot of fights with other dogs who just, he couldn't communicate how friendly he was, and other dogs just didn't trust him. But in negotiation, it's kind of the same thing. Like, you need to send signals to the other person that they can trust you, because without trust, you will not be able to make progress in a negotiation. So, how do you establish trust? And how do you do this with strangers? And how do you do it even with adversaries? Well, one simple thing you can do is act normal. Let's face it, in the eyes of society, we, meaning like all of us vegan, animal rights activists, are considered freaks. Society has already dismissed our ideas, they dismissed us, and they've dismissed our arguments. So one easy way to help break through this is to just engage in social norms when you're negotiating. When the other person realizes that you are normal and reasonable like they are, and maybe that's not the case for everyone, maybe you have to act like someone who's not reasonable, but it increases the chance that they will think that your ideas are normal and reasonable. So you want to do things like engage in small talk, as annoying as that is. You want to talk about the weather. You want to crack some jokes, talk about popular TV shows. As stupid as this sounds, it is very effective for helping to build trust when it's not there. Another way to build trust is to do what you say you're going to do when you said you were going to do it. If you promise to send an email to a company with many resources in it, send an email to that company with those resources. If you said you were going to get back to someone by next Friday, get back to that person by next Friday. Even little things like punctuality to meetings can demonstrate trust and integrity. And following through basically demonstrates integrity, and integrity is absolutely foundational for trust. Also, presenting yourself as in a less adversarial position is very helpful for building trust, especially in negotiations. The best way to do this is to make yourself appear as the middle person or the liaison or the messenger. This type of positioning allows you to even act as if you're doing them some type of favor. It also helps remove this us versus them mentality from the conversation. And once you establish trust, you can use this to your advantage, such as to get more information or to gain insights into what's really going on inside of a company, or what the other person is actually thinking in their minds. All right. The third principle is to build latitude. You basically, when you're in negotiation, you want to establish as many alternative routes to pivot to and from when one is not working. Now, there are many types of negotiations. This is the negotiation clock created by Steve Gates in his book, The Negotiation Book, which basically lays out all the common forms of negotiation. The ones on the right are your left. No, that's your right. They are the ones that are more difficult. In all schools of negotiation, policy work, like getting a cage-free policy from a company, is considered to be the most difficult form of negotiation. And that's because it's simply a win-lose type of negotiation. It's a competitive form of negotiation. You either get the policy or you don't. Like in the end, it's just yes or no. But there's a lot more space between yes and no than we may actually realize. In the context, strictly in the context of a negotiation, no does not mean no, and it does not mean absolutely not, and it does not mean that the conversation is over. In fact, this is where a lot of the interesting parts of a conversation can start. So when you get a no from a company, it just simply means, what's a different question to be asked here? What's a different approach I can take? For example, let's say you're approaching a company like Starbucks. You want to get them to adopt a cage-free policy. They respond saying, we can't do this at this time, but we really support what you're doing. We think it's great. Keep up the good work. In business terms, that's basically a hard no. So now the company has said no to the only thing that you're asking them of. So what do you do now? Well, what you do is you introduce new variables to negotiate on. The more variables that are introduced, the more lateral movement and maneuverability you will have in the negotiation. My favorite one is introducing something like the last one, where you introduce a variable that you weren't talking about before, and one that you don't even care about. Because then you can come to some type of compromise on that with the company, and then use that as a bargaining chip to get something else, another variable that you do care about. All right, principle number 4 is to be default aggressive. What does this mean? In simple terms, it means that when you're in negotiations, your default mode should always be that of the aggressor. You always want to be playing offense, not defense. You want to be the one on the attack. Does this mean that you go around just starting conflicts for no reason, or just being reckless, or hostile or mean to another person? No. Does this mean being hostile in the negotiations? Sometimes, but not necessarily. Being default aggressive means really taking control of the conversation. In negotiations, you may be surprised at the strange directions a conversation can take about a seemingly simple issue. But it's your responsibility to make sure that the conversation stays on topic. Yes, you do need to listen to what the other person is saying and demonstrate that. You need to demonstrate that you will answer their questions if they have any, but you need to ultimately and relentlessly bend the conversation back to the issue at hand. Being default aggressive is also about being proactive and being one step ahead of your opponent. For example, when I'm giving a negotiations training to another organization, one of the first things I do is I sit down with the group. We all brainstorm for hours about all the different possible excuses that a company may make. Some of these are the more common ones. Some may be specific to the country, etc. We list them all out on paper. Then we take all of them and we sort them out and organize them into 5 different categories or less. And then we design our talking points so that no matter what excuse the opponent, like the company, may try to use, one of those talking points that we designed will address that. However, negotiations are not 100% predictable, and you may get thrown a curveball now and then, or you might just enter a situation that you're less familiar with. There will also be times where you feel that the plan that you made going in, like to a meeting, for instance, for the negotiation is actually not the best approach. For example, you meet with a company and your plan is to just threaten a campaign action against them. But, if they, in the case that they show any signs of hesitation. So that's your methodology, right? If they do X, we do Y. But it turns out you get in there and they're super friendly, super likable. They're a bit more serious about the issue than last time you talked to them. So now your instinct is, oh, maybe we shouldn't threaten them. Maybe we need to maintain the relationship and not stick to the plan. That tension that you're feeling in that moment, that's called instinct versus methodology. Basically, do you stick to the plan or do you go with your instinct? And how do you know which one to follow? This is not so easy. But one of the first things you have to do, you have to detach from the situation. Basically, you need to pause and step back and assess the situation. Obviously, not in the context of a singular conversation. You don't want to just walk out in the middle of a discussion. But rather, when you're having an ongoing negotiation that includes multiple conversations, you just really need to step back and think before you go into the next one. Doing so will give you the opportunity to take the correct course of action. Now, this can be particularly helpful when decisions get really tough and stakes are very, very high. For example, a few years ago, I was working with one of the world's largest supermarket chains, had a great working relationship with them. I was asking the company to expand their existing cage-free policy to cover all of Europe, and to be one of the first ones to do that. After many months of deliberation, the company came back and said, sorry, we can't do it. And it was clear that we were at an impasse in negotiations. But thanks to methodology, I knew that the next time I go in there, I just have to be hyper-aggressive, threaten a campaign. But I was very nervous and very unsure if that would be the right move because it would put the relationship at risk. And plus, at the time, we didn't have any strong campaign groups in their other markets. So if we were to go threaten them with like an international campaign, it would be a total bluff. And if they called that bluff, it would be disastrous for the movement. So essentially, I knew that threatening them would lead to one of two outcomes. Outcome A, they get scared, do the policy, we win a massive victory for animals. Outcome 2, it ruins our relationship. We appear weak, and then we can't do anything about it. With stakes this high, very serious doubt started creeping into my mind, and I didn't know what to do. I remember the stress I felt after that meeting. I was literally pacing back and forth out front of the building, chain smoking, thinking about what is the right thing to do here. And then I asked myself one very simple question. As if I was going to put money on one of these outcomes, like which one would happen? Which would it be? And then that started precipitating all other types of key questions in my mind. Like, how have they responded to pressure in the past? How have their competitors responded? How sensitive is a company's image? Things like that. And the answer just became immediately clear. It was very likely that outcome A was going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. And detaching from the situation is also helpful because sometimes you are so focused on reaching your goal that you start framing things almost like a false dichotomy. You start, it's like option 1 or option 2, and you're trying to get them to go to option 2. But stepping back can really help you realize that there are more effective ways to frame your demands. And we do this in policy work. If we ask a company to go from cages to baseline cage-free systems, the jump looks big, right? But if we frame it within extremes, then all of a sudden, the same ask as before appears pretty small and quite reasonable. And this is a classic sales technique, but it remains quite effective today. Also, detaching yourself from the situation can help illuminate where your arguments are strongest and where you should anchor the conversation. In one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, Conor McGregor fought Nate Diaz, a vegan fighter, by the way, during UFC 196. At the time, McGregor was the undefeated world champion and known for his supreme kicks and punches and strikes. Where Diaz, on the other hand, he was more known for his stamina and grappling. In the second round, McGregor was getting visibly tired and decided he was going to take Diaz to the ground for some grappling. Everyone that was watching this immediately knew, they were all detached from the situation. They immediately knew that was a fatal mistake. And McGregor ended up losing the fight because of that. Now, in negotiation, we have to be careful to not make the same mistake that McGregor did by stepping outside of our area of expertise. Instead, we want to keep driving the conversation back to where our arguments are strongest. Now, high-pressure negotiations can feel very personal, and tensions may run high, emotions may run high, especially when you need to remain firm in your position. It's easy to start conflating being firm with being disrespectful. I can tell you from experience, though, that being disrespectful almost never pays off. Remember that you are negotiating with another human being, so you want to show respect, just through your simple things like your tone of voice and practicing common courtesies. These things will go a very long way. All right, principle number 6, train and simulate. All of this, is very hard to keep in mind in the heat of the moment. So, what you should do, you want to train for this as much as possible. You want to get to the point where this stuff just becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it. And that's principle number 6. In the martial art of jiu-jitsu, there are 4 principles on how to learn. First, you watch your teacher and you study your teacher and what they are doing. Then you practice, and you practice it slowly with another person over and over and over again. Then you apply it by actually grappling and wrestling with other people. And then finally, you teach what you have learned to someone else. And this does not just apply to jiu-jitsu. This is how you achieve mastery of really anything. You're playing the guitar, whatever. But it definitely applies to negotiation as well. Now, in corporate policy work, we simulate real-life negotiation scenarios all the time. These simulations, they're super fun, but they can also be very nerve-wracking and can feel very uncomfortable. But guess what? Real-life negotiations are nerve-wracking. They're uncomfortable. And you feel all types of intense emotions when you're in them. And the first time you're feeling all these intense emotions and reacting to them, that should not be happening in a high-stakes, real-life negotiation. So the benefit of simulation is that it prepares you for these situations, almost for anything that will happen. So you can get a friend to practice with, or get in touch with the Open Wing Alliance. We can help facilitate spaces for this. There are also some resources that you may find helpful. There's a couple digital resources I can recommend. Negotiate Anything is a great podcast. They interview top negotiators in their field for a full hour, sometimes more. It's free. It's full of great tips. Highly recommend it. Then there's a masterclass course by Chris Voss, the FBI negotiator I was talking about earlier. That's an online course in negotiation. This one does cost money, and I can't actually personally recommend it because I've never taken that course. But I've heard from other respected negotiators that it's a good one, so recommending it from them. And if you prefer books or audio books, here are a few which I can recommend. The first is Never Split the Difference. That's by Chris Voss again. This is a great first book if you're just getting into the subject. Then there's the Negotiation book by Steve Gates, and this is a great kind of overview of negotiation. Also another great one to start with. There's one called Persuasion, which discusses tactics for priming a conversation so that you can get the answers you want. So it's kind of helpful to drive the conversation. And finally, there's Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, a former champion poker player, which kind of shares strategies for making decisions when you don't have all the information in front of you. And finally, principle number 7 is just to get started, and get started as soon as possible. You know, you shouldn't feel like you should not get started because you are new, or you feel like you need to learn more first. You know, that's a trap. There will always be more to learn. Trust me. You want to get started and then learn along the way. So thank you very much. I'm here for your questions.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So here are the questions from the audience. There are not that many of them, so I'm sure some of you aren't aware that you can post your questions via Eventory app, so please do so if you have any. And I will begin with a question from Maciej. Can you give some examples of inconsequential variables that you've used in your work?
Sure. So sometimes when you're negotiating with a company, you know that you want a policy that covers, for instance, all of their eggs in all locations with a certain timeline. One variable that you can negotiate or introduce is, for instance, okay, the company says no, but let's give them a deadline before we launch campaign actions, and they have to take some type of action that we want to see them take in the interim. A lot of times, you don't necessarily care about when those actions might actually start, so you can be pretty flexible on that. The company may not know that, and you could say, we've got a very firm deadline, or this is going to happen. And then you might start negotiating on what type of action that they take, or you might start negotiating on that deadline that you maybe don't care about so much. And then that is, maybe if you don't care about that and you come to some compromise and agreement, you can demonstrate that you're working with them, you gave something to the negotiation. Now what do I get? And you start saying, okay, what about the timeline? And you start shifting to the other variables.
Okay, a question from Anna now. Have you ever had an exec who uses your techniques or is aware of these negotiation tactics, and have they backfired for them? Things like mirroring.
Yeah. There are some very good negotiators in corporations, and some of them I want to come work for the Humane League. But yeah, there are definitely times where you're negotiating with someone who's very good at their job, and they are actually, I've been tricked many times in negotiations where they start taking the conversation and moving it away from the topic at hand, and they just continually start asking me questions. So now I'm just responding to their questions and thinking about my answers, and then the conversation is veering away from what we came here to talk about, and it's very hard to stay focused sometimes in the meeting. And that's one of the reasons why you always want to be on the offense. You want to be the one asking them all the questions and put them on the spot. But yeah, sometimes you run into negotiators that are very skilled, and it can be tough sometimes. You don't win all of them. I definitely have not won all of them.
Yeah, I think the question also specified, are there any dangers to using these tactics like mirroring? Are there any flaws, potential risks?
I say yes. I would say the biggest is using the same tactic too much. If you use the same tactic too much, they're going to catch on. So you really gotta shift your tactics when you're in negotiations with a company, especially one that you've been negotiating with for a long time. If you've been negotiating with someone for a number of years, they know you by now, and eventually they're going to start becoming immune to your tactics. So you just have to change it up. It's like a virus and an antivirus kind of battle, you know.
Okay, great. And could you give examples of negotiations that went really bad?
Negotiations that went really bad. Yes. I can't specify, just for privacy reasons, the name of companies, but yeah, there are examples of negotiations where we went in there and we had this whole playbook laid out, you know, all of our very carefully thought through, and the company just kept kind of stringing us along for a while, and slowly, you know, when we first met with them, they were like, hey, we're going to do your policy. We think it's great. We're going to adopt it. And then slowly over time, very cleverly, they started eroding the policy. And then it just got worse and worse and worse until they got to the point where they're like, yeah, but they kept saying, yeah, we're doing your policy. And then they published something that was not our policy. And yeah, and now we're, you know, it's got a little contentious. And then just to add on to that, some companies will, when you do have to take the more aggressive approach, there are times, you know, usually that works, keeping the dialogue open, but sometimes the company will shut down and just stop talking to you. So that's definitely a risk you have to be aware of too.
Okay, a disappointed viewer is asking, why haven't you brought your cowboy hat this time?
Oh, sorry, I only had so much room in my suitcase.
Okay, that explains it.
Yeah.
Do animal welfare negotiations with food service companies often end with a win-win? What are some potential gains for companies adopting regulations that are limiting to them?
So, what are some benefits to like adopting a policy we want them to?
Yeah.
Some benefits I would say is that, you know, a lot of companies, they want to present a certain image about themselves. Like they care about society, for instance. And so they have these corporate social responsibility departments. They have corporate social responsibility websites. A lot of times they don't have a lot of substantial things to put on that website to demonstrate that they are, you know, they're part of civil society and they're taking action for it. So a benefit could be like, this is a very substantial thing that you can put on your website and demonstrate that you're taking action to improve the lives of animals, as an example.
Okay, so I think we have time for two more. What was your biggest negotiation failure, and what did you learn from it? I'm not sure if the previous one you mentioned, the eroding policy, was yours specifically, but maybe something to add to this.
I've had many of those. Probably my biggest one was when it was in the early stages of the broiler campaign, when the product that we were asking them to adopt, it actually was not there yet. It's much more developed now and is, but at the time it wasn't. And I kept thinking in my mind before I went in the negotiation, don't bring up the fact that this doesn't exist yet. And it was kind of like that phenomenon when people are driving through the desert and they hit like the only pole that's in the desert, and they get fixated on that. So I was in the negotiation and I totally said what I didn't want to say, and it immediately just destroyed the negotiation, and yeah, totally lost that one.
Okay, and
But just to be clear, there are many other examples.
And lessons from that?
That I think comes with like just getting more comfortable. I think like that came out of nerves. Like I wasn't very familiar with the issue yet at the time, and I think that is something that just comes with time, and that's why it's important to really practice this a lot.
Okay, so to conclude, your favorite negotiation anecdote. Do you have anything to story?
Yeah. Let's see. Probably my favorite one was I was meeting with it's the biggest manufacturer of baked goods in the world. Super, super big company. I went in there with a suit that I had bought from a thrift store that I didn't realize was literally falling apart. And I was sitting at the table, getting into the negotiation, being very firm with the company, threatening them. Meanwhile, one of my buttons fell off and rolled across the table. And the executive just kindly handed it back to me. And then I just jumped back into what I was talking about before.
Okay, thank you. That's a great way to end it, and thanks for a great talk. And yeah, thanks a lot, Aaron Ross. Thank you.